Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Let me check the connection first. We have to make sure that everybody can hear us. So if you could hear me clearly, please type something in the live stream studio. Hi, everybody. If you could hear me, you type 1 or yes. Good. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to our 57th session of Reading Linguist Paper Together. Today, we're again honored to have Professor Gries from University of California, Santa Barbara with us. Now, he will do a guided reading of his new article, which was published this month, last week, right? Just yes. Came out last week.
Yes.
So this paper is the latest development in collostructional analysis, research method pioneered by Professor Gries and his collaborators in 2003. Ever since then, 20 years have passed. This statistical method has been in constant revision and development. We're going to hear the latest one. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Gries to guide us through this new article. Professor Gries, I'll set you as a chair so you can share your screen and everybody else could see that, your screen and hear your voice. Just a moment. I'll transfer the chair to you.
All right, perfect. All right, so welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. So the way I want to do it is maybe a little, well, it's definitely a little different from what you're used to, but I'm hoping you will see why this is, why I'm doing it the way I will do it. So we're going to go through this paper, and the way we're going to do the reading here is basically actually with note-taking at the same time. So I'm going to switch back and forth between the PDF that you're seeing right now and another application that looks like this. So right now it's just a blank screen. And the basic idea will be to go through this paper and then develop in this app that you will see in a moment, and you will actually maybe recognize it if you've ever been to my website. So develop in this app basically an overview of what the paper is trying to do. Okay. All right, let's do that. So the paper is called Overhauling Collostructional Analysis towards more descriptive simplicity and more explanatory adequacy. So when it comes to reading this, I would, of course, as everybody, I guess, recommend that you read the abstract first. And so we'll do that. And then I'll switch to the other app to discuss, to show how I would recommend that people read stuff. And then we'll develop this thing together. Okay, so the paper says, or the abstract says, in this paper, I make two sets of suggestions of how collostructional analysis can be updated. One set of suggestions involves simplifying the analysis for descriptive exploratory purposes, while at the same time enriching it with bootstrapped confidence intervals. Okay, so that's the first of apparently several suggestions, minimally 2, because that's what I say here. So the way I would then recommend we proceed here, let me just get the size right. So I hope you can see that. Would be to basically start some note-taking here. So this is my paper, and it's about overhauling collostructural analysis. Okay, and then apparently there's at least changes to something I will use in a moment. So, all right. So, and one goal is to simplify. One set of suggestions I will make is simplification for description or exploratory purposes. So that's one thing we will want to do. So this is goal 1. Okay. All right. Back to the paper. The other set of suggestions involves the idea that we should move away from a single kind of association measure for theoretical and exploratory purposes, and instead quantify collostructional attraction as a tuple of minimally 3 orthogonal dimensions, namely frequency, association, and dispersion. Okay, so that's the second thing the paper apparently wants to do. So we go here. Change this a little bit. So make it a little lighter because it's a different level of indentation. Okay. So second goal is quantify colleague seam or quantify stuff as a tuple of 3 orthogonal dimensions. That's what the abstract said. Okay, so that's going to be goal 2, apparently. Make it a little smaller. And then the paper also said there were 3 different dimensions. One was frequency, one was association, and one was dispersion. Okay, so apparently that's what the paper wants to do. Okay. So again, a little bit lighter like this. So let's see what else. Because only this kind of analysis will be able to address all dimensions relevant to cognitive usage-based constructions. Okay, so this is the reason why we do this. So let's just add this note here. So dimensions relevant to cognitive usage-based linguistics. Okay, so this is why we include that. So like this. Okay, and then in addition, I end with a renewed plea to take the notion of construction more seriously rather than looking at association of constructions to forms. I would like us to go back to looking at associations of constructions to constructions, i.e. to take the meaning of functional pole of constructions more seriously and include sense/functions in all kinds of collostructional analysis more. So let's note this as well. That's kind of a third goal or like an end goal or something like this. So take constructions seriously. So that's going to be, apparently, the author says it's going to be at the end. All right. And then how so? By including senses in the analysis. All right. So that's apparently what this part will do. All right. Let's save this because, well, we don't want to lose that. Put it on desktop. All right. Done. So let's just move things around a bit so I have more space. Like that. All right, so let's go back to the paper. So the paper then apparently has a section called Traditional Collostructional Analysis. So it talks about what construction grammar is, it talks about what a construction is, and then it gets to the paper. You know, one of the most widespread corpus linguistic approaches, methods to study blah, blah, is collostructional analysis. A family of 3 methods, all of which share applying an association measure-based approach towards the co-occurrence of constructions that usually differ in their level of schematicity. And then there are 3 methods. One is called colleague seam analysis, one is called distinctive colleague seam analysis, one is called covariing colleague seam analysis, okay? Apparently also distinctive comes in 2 versions, a simple one and a multiple distinctive one. And the covariing colleague seam analysis comes in 2 versions, namely an item-based one and a system-based one. So let's note that down. So that's kind of, let's say, it's a little bit of background information right now. So we don't yet know exactly how this will be used. So background information says, let's make this blue or something. So there is colleague seam analysis, there's distinctive colleague seam analysis, and there's covariing colleague seam analysis. Okay, so typos, whatever. Okay, so those are the 3 subtypes, apparently. Yes. 3 different types. Let's make this a little lighter because it's one level down the hierarchy. Like this. And then it said there's a simple distinctive colloxime analysis. Simple, and there's a multiple one. And then there's item-based and system-based. Right, so those two go here, those two here. That, okay, and again, we'll make this one level, oops, one level lighter because it's one level of indentation further down, like this. Okay. So colloxime analysis, one looks at constructions in a more schematic construction, distinctive, how much constructions dislike to occur in a slot of usually more schematic constructions when we have alternative ones. And then covariant colloxime analysis, one looks at how much constructions like to occur in one and at the same time in the second slot of the same construction. Okay. So of these 5 methods, 2 have been the most widely used ones, and they involve computing a bidirectional association measure, it says, from the traditional 2x2 co-occurrence tables that are used for association measures in collocational research. Okay, so for colloxime analysis, we do a table like here, it says here, we do a table like table 1, where we have words and other words and a construction and other constructions. And then we have this A, B, C, D corpus frequency table. And then for a simple distinctive colloxime analysis, it's actually the same kind of table. The only difference is that now it's not one construction like the ditransitive versus any other ones, but now it's one construction against another construction. But it's the same type of A, B, C, D, blah, blah, blah kind of table. So let's briefly note that down here as well. Kind of crude here because this thing doesn't have tables, I think, or I don't know about it. But so we have a table like, okay, the A frequency, the B frequency, and then A plus B, we have a C and a D, C plus D, and then obviously that's adds up to A plus C, B plus D, and then N. So that is what all these, what most of these require, especially the colloxime and the distinctive colloxime analysis. So that's what's the input to these. And then the paper says, okay, this has been used in psycholinguistic contexts and second and foreign language learning contexts and work on language change. It's been applied with experimental work. Okay, that's all nice and great, but it's actually not, it's just background information, right? It doesn't advance the main argument. And then it says, okay, there have been, people have used different kinds of measures like the Fisher-Yates exact test. Other people have criticized that. And so let's note this one down here. So one traditional measure that has been used, P Fisher-Yates exact test. Okay, and this was used by all 3 of them. So we're going to go like this. Maybe make it a little prettier, just for the fun of it. Okay, so this one. So here. Whatever, something like this. So that's one of the measures that has been used. All right. So there's a little bit talk about here how the method has been criticized. Okay, but then it goes back to this present paper. So the present paper is a follow-up to some of these things, and I will discuss 2 sets of suggestions, like I said before. And the idea is, okay, they might seem contradictory at first glance, but the 2 suggestions have to do with the reason why one is performing an analysis, namely, again, descriptive or exploratory purposes or more theoretical or psycholinguistic purposes. And second, it has to do with addressing parts of criticism of how collexemic attraction has usually been measured. So apparently those are two things that have to do with the two sets of suggestions that will be made in the paper. So let's just put those here because apparently that will become important. So one important question, why are we doing such an analysis? And then the other one is, how do we measure collexemic attraction? Okay, so those are apparently, at least that's what I say, those are two things that motivated this paper. So basically those two things connected to why the paper was written in the first place. Right, so we can put that like this, and maybe highlight it in a different color. So it's something completely different. Let's make that. And again, save. All right. So, we're doing time-wise. All right. So let's see then. What does the paper say? Okay, the paper says the first set of suggestions apparently uses a collexeme analysis, namely of the ditransitive as a first example. So we go here. Yes, okay. So we go here and say, all right, first case study is the ditransitive. So we'll use the ditransitive from the ISGB. And then it talks about what the input to this kind of analysis used to be. So it says, usually the kind of input data that would in turn lead to tables such as table 1 that we saw earlier would look like table 3, especially for many people who used my RScript. So we would have a table that had, a column for the word or for the lemma, a column for the frequency of the word or the lemma in the construction, and a column with the frequency of that word or lemma in the corpus as a whole. But to set the stage for the later goal of adding things, we will use a better input format now, namely the one exemplified in table 4, where each verb use, ditransitive or not, now gets its own row, and each row also indicates which corpus file or part something is from. So that means, apparently, so apparently the new analysis here has a new form of input. That seems to be one of its big things. And the new input has column 1, which is the file, column 2, which is the verb form, be the lemma, but doesn't have to be. And then column 3 or 4, depending on whether we have a third column, is whether something is a ditransitive or not. Okay, so that's the new input format. That spreadsheet needs to look like this. All right. Right, so this is the 3-column input format. This is the 4-column input format. Okay, and so then what do we do with this? Well, first we compute the author, me, computes some well-known measures, because the idea is, if I'm exemplifying, or if I make the case that we need a new kind of measure, then obviously we want to see, okay, how does it compare to the old ones? So I'm computing some well-known measures, namely the log of the Fisher-Yates exact test, the log likelihood value, and the log odds ratio. Also pointwise MI and random effects from a mixed effects model. So on top of the traditional measure of PFWE here, we also we have G squared that will be computed here or has been computed by others in the past. The log odds ratio, we have MI, and we have random effects from some regression model. That's something we will actually not discuss here much. Okay, but those are all measures that have been used in the past and that will be used for benchmarking purposes here as well. Okay. So suggestion set 1, simplification. So that's what we're talking about here, right? Goal 1, simplification, and we already know we're going to use the ditransitive for this. So what is the new measure now? Back then, with traditional approaches, I always wondered why people computed their association measures by generating all these 2x2 co-occurrence tables, one for each word, right? So essentially, I was wondering, why are people doing this stuff here? Because when I started learning statistics 1,000 years ago, I always thought, why don't we just use the residuals of a chi-square test? And so the first suggestion in this paper is to do just that. So instead of computing 3,368 G squared values for that whole table, or for one kind of table, or 88 for another one of table, we simply compute a single chi-square statistic on the complete cross tabulation and get the residuals of the chi-square test out of it. The residuals of this chi-square test indicate how observed frequencies relate to the expected ones. So they tell us whether a word is attracted to the ditransitive or whether it is repelled by the ditransitive. So let's note that down. So first thing is we had new input. Second thing is we have a new measure that we're using. Okay, just a little small like this. So here. And the new measure is, here's some residuals on the chi-square test. Okay, the beauty of this, the way we take the notes here is that you actually don't, right now, to proceed with this, you don't need to know how this is actually computed. Right, but still, this way of note taking here enables you to see, like, okay, this is the structure of the argument, even if right now, maybe before I read it up on it somewhere else, I don't know how this is computed. We can still understand the structure of the paper. And what do the Pearson residuals tell us? Well, if they are negative, that means something is repelled. If they are positive, if they are positive, something is attracted. Okay, that's good. And apparently it's much faster because we only compute a single test and not potentially thousands of them. So that's, of course, nice. So those are the advantages and the interpretation. So table 7 shows results, blah, blah, blah. Here are the results. Words that never, verbs that never occur in the ditransitive, like be or consist, have highly negative residuals. They are repelled by the construction. Verbs that occur in the ditransitive a lot, like give and tell and ask, they have very high positive residuals. So it works exactly like one would want. Now, the question, of course, is how does this measure compare to the more established ones? And so figure 1 shows a variety of scatter plots. And what are the findings? Well, actually, so the new measure here is correlated always more than 0.93 with all the existing measures that quantify association. And it's 0.6 correlated with frequency. But so 0.92 and higher, so very highly correlated with the traditional measures. And that in spite of the fact that it's computed much faster. So let's note that down. So not only is it much faster, it's also well correlated with the traditional measures. So that's obviously a good thing, right? So another advantage. And maybe just to make that super clear, so the traditional measures were those over here. Okay. This thing. Like that. Oh no, that's not super pretty. Maybe I'll change that later. All right. Okay, so that's what the first case study shows. Now, the second case study is apparently an application to a distinctive Collex seam analysis. So let's put that here. So the second case study is a distinctive Collex seam analysis of what? Of transitive phrasal verb data. So let's note that transitive phrasal verb data. So that's case study 2. Let's make that case study 1. And okay, comes in a very similar format, the input, and ultimately boils down to a table like this, where for every particle verb or transitive phrasal verb, we know how often it occurs in this construction or in that construction. So VOP means someone said, point the problem out or something like that. Point is the verb, the problem is the object, out is the particle, and VPO would be, point out the problem. V is point, P is the particle out, and then O is the problem, the direct object. And again, apparently I'm computing the chi-squared residuals, and that's it. And then we can sort the table, and we get results that show how much each verb form likes, or which of the two constructions each lemma prefers, and how much so. Meaning, actually, here we can just say, we can just say for this case study, we actually also use the new measure. And again, we're using Pearson residuals, and everything else means the same as well. Now, is it also well correlated with traditional measures? Apparently, yes. The results replicate our earlier study from 2004 nearly perfectly with the Spearman rank correlation of 0.94 or even an R squared from a GAM of 0.996. So basically, this little arrow here, this one here, basically inherits everything from the previous case, right? So the transitive phrasal verb study also uses this new measure, which is this. It's interpreted in the same way. It's also much faster, and it's also well correlated with the rest. So that's obviously a good thing. Okay. Application 3, multiple distinctive Collex seam analysis. We're still in the first goal. What am I looking at here? Oh, apparently futures. So going to future versus will future versus the shall future. So that's the third case study. So the third case study is futures. Let me put it like this. Okay, and so now, in order to make this a little bit clearer, we're actually going to label the arrows. So this is a multiple distinctive Collex seam analysis. This was the distinctive Collex seam analysis, and this was the simple Collex seam analysis. So now every one of the arrows also says, what the results were. And apparently, it's the same method. We compute chi-squared residuals, and we're essentially done. the table gets sorted, so we can now see these are the verbs that like to go with going to. So apparently speakers of English like to say, I'm going to say, I'm going to do, I'm going to go, I'm going to ask, and stuff like that. And for will, maybe the more natural counterpoint, apparently people will say probably it, it'll depend, I'll know, I'll become, I'll include, or something like that. And then the most formal one, shall, actually also goes with formal things. No, this shall preclude, this shall refer. This here is probably we shall see, or something like that, right? That's probably going to happen in a corpus. So again, we have, positive values indicating attraction, and giving out a listing for every one of the three constructions. Now, does this work? How does it compare to the previous results? Okay, the results cannot be straightforwardly compared to the previous analysis because we didn't do a multiple distinctive colleague scheme analysis 20 years ago. But the results are the results for the most comparable future construction are still quite similar. So 6 out of the top 10 are actually shared across the two constructions. So for now, I'm going to say, okay, same thing here. So it also uses the same measure, and has the same effects and so on. So everything basically works very similar. Spary. Let me make this round. Yeah, I guess it's good enough. It doesn't need to be super pretty. Okay. All right, interim discussion. So the results are promising. I hope you agree with me on that. Everything's pretty fast. And now there's, as we can see, there's actually two excursus. One having to do with variability in section 3.5, and one having to do with significant association in 3.6. So let's very briefly check out what those are about. So excursus, variability of collostructional results. The idea is to compute confidence intervals, which apparently can be done in two ways, based on random sampling with replacement on the level of data points, or on the basis of random sampling for, let's say, files or something like this. And so apparently I'm proceeding with the latter, because what we want to do is we want to compute uncertainty of colleague scheme strengths. So let's note that down. So this out of the way for now. So excursus 1, quantifying uncertainty with bootstrapping. And the reason why this is possible is because, well, everything is much faster now. That would have been difficult before. So this gets connected with both sides, actually. Okay, and this one, all this stuff is important. So how is this done? What are the steps? Again, you don't need to understand bootstrapping like fully, but you can take notes of the structure of the approach. So we draw a random, so we do something 500 times. Namely, for each of these 500 times, we draw a random sample of all corpus files with replacement, make them a corpus, and then we do the chi-squared residuals computation just like before, and save the results so that we can then compute for each verb the 2.5% and the 97.5% quantiles, meaning we get the difference between these two is 95, right? So we get the 95% confidence interval. So so these are the steps. 500 random samples with replacement, make that the corpus, compute Pearson residuals, save results, compute confidence interval. First this, then that, then this, then that, then that. Okay, so that's what this part of the paper is about. You can just move it slightly up like that. Okay, and then we can see, for example, that actually tell and give, the confidence intervals overlap. So they are actually not significantly different from each other, but they are significantly different from all the rest. And the rest actually, and this is one big difference to traditional collostructional analysis of the way that you may know them. So those are actually hardly significantly different from each other. I mean, they all overlap a little bit. So the result really only says, tell and give are super different from the rest. And the rest is just a very small Klein. There's not really that much going on. And then the paper does the same for distinctive Colloq-Seam analyses. So it looks at the VPO constructions, it looks at the VOP constructions, and gives us the same kind of Klein here. So we can really actually just note that this works. We can bear in mind basically that this works both for the Colloq-Seam analysis and for the distinctive Colloq-Seam analysis. So no additional notes basically are required here right now. Oops. Okay, again, space here. All right, so what's the second excursus? It's on significant association. I'm going to treat this very briefly because it's not that important right now, but we can see here, I've treated the results as equivalent to confidence intervals. And if those don't overlap with 0, then we consider a result significant. Now, a reader might say, well, but we don't need that. We actually had that before already. But then with some mathematical discussion that I'm going to skip now, what it means is that the normal kinds of significance tests for collocations actually don't work. They are actually all wrong. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if you are interested. However, the proper way to proceed is what we did here, bootstrapping by sampling with replacement on the levels of files. And with that, we can now more properly interpret our results as actual significance tests or confidence intervals. So that's the second big item here. So excursus 2. Now we have real p-values. And again, maybe you right now don't have a lot of statistical knowledge to understand exactly the logic, but we can still note down that that's part of the structure of the paper, and we can revisit that at a later stage if we want to, if one's interested. Okay, suggestion set 2, using multiple dimensions separately. So introduction and a thought experiment. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine for a moment you knew nothing about corpus-based association measures and their application to words and constructions. But imagine that as a cognitive or usage-based linguist, someone told you, okay, you have to develop the ideal association measure approach to study word constructions associations. What dimensions of information might be relevant? Well, actually the ones you already saw in the abstract. Frequency is one of them. And here's some quotes why it's important. Association is the second one of them. And again, some quotes why it's important. And third, a third dimension, namely dispersion. And here's some discussion why that is important. So here, the good thing is we actually already have that information because that was in the abstract. Right? So whoops. So we already know that is stuff we will want to deal with. Okay, move this up here. Okay, so we have a little more space. Okay, other dimensions might be relevant, but apparently are not used here. Frequency, association, and dispersion are probably among the most essential ones to a truly cognitive approach. And so how do we measure them? Frequency is straightforward. We count and log. Okay. Association is trickier. And for reasons that I discuss here, a measure such as the log odds ratio behaves as desired, which is what we will use here. Finally, adding dispersion is tricky because most dispersion measures are very highly correlated with frequency. So here we are using a measure of dispersion that can be adjusted to not reflect frequency, and we're going to do that here as well. So case study 1, ditransitives in the ISGB. And so we're computing, so this is the explanation of how the dispersion measure is computed. But in general, it seems, we have results for, we have results that indicate the frequency of a word in the construction, the association of the word in a construction, and the dispersion of the word and the construction across the corpus. And so we have this 3D plot for this, but we also have this maybe easier to understand different plot for this, where frequency is the word size, right? So give and tell are printed with the largest font. Association is here and dispersion is here. And so the idea obviously seems to be that we compute all of these things at the same time and then plot them. So case study 1, ditransitive. We computed log to co-occurrence frequency, the log odds ratio, and then a dispersion measure that I'm not going to discuss here in more detail unless you ask about it later. DP no frec. So this one's this one's this one's that. And of course, it's all being used with the ditransitive as a case study. Start here. This is how this is measured, how that is measured, and so on. And then there's a second case study, the way construction, which apparently, and I'm skipping here because we're running out of time, which is studied in the same way. Way construction. So it uses the same 3 methods. Right, so that's obviously the other part. And then finally, this thing at the end, adding senses. So looking at the verb particle constructions. So we already know from the abstract that it said include senses. Now, apparently we know that it's doing that with the case study of transitive phrasal verbs. Flatter. Verbs. So here's some theoretical discussion of this. Okay, obviously, you would have to read that. But then what does this one here do? Okay, so this one, this study says, okay, I took 3 of the most frequent transitive phrasal verbs, namely carry out, pick up, and put down. Okay, and then computed the collostructional analysis. We can redo all of the above analysis and we get figure 10 as a result. So we have, what was that? Carry out, pick up, put down. That's the case study. Now the question, of course, is what's the result? obviously different senses of the same word, of the same, letter sequence can have different attractions, right? Put down in the sense of insist and denigrate have a VOP preference, but put down in the sense of kill and write have a VPO preference. So the conclusion here is, there are big differences for verb sense pairings. This is called pairs. Shorter and then S. Okay, so, and that's the important conclusion here. Right, and here the important thing was, use 3 different dimensions. Okay, and then there's a short conclusion that basically recaps what we just did. And so what we have now, after having gone through all this, is, this would be the overview. This would be the overview of the paper. Is it lit up? So this would be the overview of the paper or the summary of the paper. Again, maybe you don't know right now how this is exactly done, but you know what role it plays in the paper because you can see exactly all the things that it is related to, all the things that follow from it, and so on. Same thing here. Maybe you can't write your script to do bootstrapping, but here you at least see, what it does, and you can see what it's good for. Namely, okay, we can quantify uncertainty, and now we have p-values. So this one actually also goes to here because that's part of it. Same thing here, right? You probably don't know at this point how to compute this, but you know what it's good for. It's good for quantifying dispersion so that we can measure association with 3 different values. And down here, we see with what case studies this was done, right? Plus, we have all the background information up here in the top left. Right, so to wrap it up, just a little late, this is basically how I would suggest that one reads stuff like that. So now I'm obviously happy to take however many questions you might have. I'm leaving this on, but of course I don't see anything right now because of the sharing thing.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gries. Well, I think here I speak for everybody, how we wish we could read every paper like this. May I ask whether you could share the mind map, export it as a PDF and send it to me, and so I can share with the other club members. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I can do that. No problem.
Thank you so much. So everybody, now it's a Q&A time. If you have any questions, type your question in live stream studio, and I will read the question to Professor Gries. So if you don't have any question right now, or you're still thinking of phrasing your questions, I would like to ask one question. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you see, chi-square analysis has some assumptions. One of them is that there should be no more than 20% of the cells that has an expected value smaller than 5. But if we take all of those lexical items into consideration, many of our cells would be 0 because they do not, appear in this construction. So would that violate the assumption of chi-square tests? There are so many zeros in the table.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question actually, because there's 2 sets of responses to that. But the good news is, they both actually address the problem. I mean, they make it not be a problem. So one is this. So of course, it's perfectly possible, and I actually did this in the paper. You can restrict the chi-square test residual computation to only those verbs that are actually attested in the construction, right? So if you have the input data frame like I showed, then you just, I'm using R, of course, you might use Python, but what I would do is say, restrict it to the cases where the ditransitive column is not 0. right? So that brings it down from the 3,368 to the 88 that actually are attested in there. Now, it's still possible that there are zeros in the table because maybe a verb shows up only one time in the ditransitive and 0 times elsewhere. So I'll address the second component of your question in a moment, right? But that's the first one. So you can drastically, by thousands and thousands, reduce the numbers of zeros by that. Okay. Now, the bigger question, the bigger response is actually sort of a little bit statistical. But so so it's true, the chi-square test. So a chi-square, let's put it this way, a chi-square test has the assumption that, the expected frequencies, not the observed one, right? But the expected frequencies are 5 or greater. Okay, but here's the thing, and I know this will sound as if I'm nitpicking, but it's true. That is an assumption of the chi-square test. We're not doing a chi-square test. We're computing the residuals of what would be a chi-square test. So what I mean by this is the following. The chi-square test has this assumption with the 5, with the 5 minimal expected frequency, because if the data don't obey that restriction, the p-value of the one p-value of the whole chi-square test becomes unreliable. But we're not even computing this, right? I didn't show you a p-value of a chi-square test. We only computed observed, expected, and then what the residuals would be, or the contributions to chi-squared, and that's it. So the step where the expected frequency of 5 becomes relevant, the computation of a p-value for the whole chi-square test is never done. So it doesn't arise. We're just computing the residuals, and then we rank order, and we kind of sidestep the question of that p-value. It never even gets computed.
Yeah. And it's also related to my second question that I meant to ask, the question about significance test, because when we take all those items into consideration in chi-square test, the degree of freedom would be very large as one parameter for the chi-square frequency.
Yes.
I read from some statistic book that the larger the degree of freedom are, the more easily to get a significant results in chi-square tests. But since in this paper, that's what some of the statistic books says, because it's quite the opposite. The larger, the more difficult to get a significant value.
Yes, because so if you have a chi-square test value of, I can even show you this, I think. Let me see whether that works here. Try and do this here. I'm not sure. There we go. Okay, is this too small to read? Or can you read it?
Yeah, I can read it. Maybe it's okay. I will share I recorded the video and I will upload the video so that participants could watch later.
Okay, so imagine you have a chi-squared value of 4. Okay, you did a test and the chi-squared value that comes out is 4. So if you have 1 degree of freedom, that means it's significant, as you will see in a moment, because that means the p-value is this. It's below 5%, just about, right? But if you get the same chi-squared value now with 3 degrees of freedom, it's not significant anymore.
Yeah. It's I checked the table for the significant value, the chi-square table. It's indeed said that the larger the degree of freedom, the larger chi-square statistics you need to get a.
Oh yes, that is true, right? The larger the chi-squared statistic you need, right? But so if the p-value stays the same, if the chi-squared value stays the same, then a larger df does not make it easier, but harder to get a significant result.
So here's the question: in this analysis, in this paper's analysis, the significance value becomes irrelevant or still relevant? Because if we only compute association or dispersion, we still need to calculate a significance value. But here we don't. We just need the residues.
Yes.
Why
So,
is that so?
well, the main reason is that if you look at the last 30 or 40 years of people doing collocational studies, and even for a lot of collostructional work, I'm going to exaggerate a little, but no one cares about the p-value, right? I mean, people compute a log likelihood score and they sort by it, but they usually, I mean, if you look at collostructional studies, they don't go all the way till the log likelihood value becomes not significant. They still only talk about the top 20 or the top 50 or something like that, right? Or with the Fisher-Yates exact value, yes, theoretically 1.3, the logged thing, would be the cutoff point, but no one cares. People use that value to rank, but they don't use it as a significance test. I mean, there are a few studies, that's why I said I'm exaggerating, there are a few studies that talked about it in terms of significance. But like I say in the paper, that's actually wrong. So the p-value of a log likelihood test or on a collocational statistic is actually wrong, because it pretends that every observation is independent of every other one, which of course is not the case, because they come in files or they have been produced by the same speakers and so on. So the short answer is, most people haven't been using significance tests as significance tests anyway. They have just used them for ranking, and all those p-values are actually wrong anyway.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Now I read some questions from the audience.
Yes.
One participant asked why the data points exaggerates the difference. Could you be more specific about your question? Because it's not very clear which data you are referred to. Why the data points exaggerate the difference? So while you are rephrasing your question, let me read another one. Is that log odds ratio for comparing two possibilities? But in corpus linguistics, there's no two possibilities. But did you understand the question? I just read it verbally.
Maybe. So it could be, the log odds ratio as an association measure in these cases here, a lot of times makes sense because the way people usually compute collostructions or collocations is with these 2x2 tables.
Yes.
Right. So you have this word versus all others together with this construction versus all others, and so you have a 2x2 table, and then you can compute an odds ratio on it, and then you can log it. Right. Or same with the distinctive collexeme analysis, right? You have give versus all other verbs, and then you have, in the ditransitive versus in the prepositional dative. So again, you have a 2x2 table like this. And so that's why for such scenarios, the log odds ratio is actually a really, really good measure. Because it's not so dependent on frequency.
Yeah, we talk about last Sunday, because the paper we read last Sunday is about the association measures. And this log ratio is actually used as a baseline for comparing other association measures. So here comes another question. It's not about the paper, it's about how you read and write things. So would you please share the differences between this reading process and your writing process? I think everybody wants to know the answer.
Well, okay. Okay, there's two answers to this, and they will sound contradictory, but I haven't thought of my writing in this way. So, but I'm going to try and make sense of it. So first, the first part of the answer is that, so actually there's not that much of a difference, because And the way I mean this is the following, like if you remember the graph, then, I mean, the graph had this flow chart kind of structure, right? So everything was either hierarchical in a sense, things were split up into subparts, and subparts were split up into, subparts and so on. And then within those things, there might be things that are hierarchical, that are sequential, like the bootstrapping explanation, stuff like that. And I do think that that's the way that, I mean, everybody who is relatively experienced at writing academically, will think about things, right? Because, I mean, just think about it this way, a paper at least, often has an introduction, methods, results, discussion, sequence, right? And so the methods part will need to say, and so the methods part is one part, and it'll have subparts, namely what the corpus is, what the data were, how you calculated the statistics, blah, blah, blah. And then the results part will be, okay, what are results here? How do you interpret them? So any paper kind of has to have a hierarchical structure like this. And the advantage of, like, how I demonstrated the reading part here is that you just make it graphically super explicit, right? Because the cool thing about such a mind map, which is, the name of this method, the cool thing is, you immediately see the whole structure of the paper. You can omit all sorts of stuff that's irrelevant. So if you look at the mind map, you only see important things, right? Because you don't see filler words, you don't see things you didn't want to include, blah, blah, blah. It's just all right there. And the other really nice thing is also that a mind map like this, and this is why it's good for writing too, actually, a mind map like this is a perfect diagnostic for whether you have a good structure, right? Because if your structure, I mean, you don't see it, but you see my hands, right? So if your structure is like, if the structure of the paper that you're currently writing is like, okay, now I'm here, and then, oh, now I'm doing here, and now I'm going here, then it's a shit structure, right? A good structure is, I go here, and now I explain this, and then this, and then this. And now I go here, and then this, and then this. So if your mind map of a paper that you're writing, but also a paper that you're reading, if someone writes a paper and it forces you to constantly do new branches because the author didn't structure things well, then it's a shitty paper. Yeah. Right. So the reading and the writing part are really, in that sense, not that different.
Yeah, actually, so I do very similar things. I use a software called Xmind. Sometimes when I did the reading, I do similar things as you did just now. I draw the structure of this paper. And also, if I cannot draw structurally easily, I might consider that this paper is not very well written.
Yes, exactly, right? And so, and the other part of the answer that's a little contradictory is that, so empirical papers, I like in my head at least, I might not draw this up anymore because I have some practice by now, but in my head at least, I do something like this. Now with overview papers, it's different. I can't exactly explain why, but I know in my head it's different. And I think the reason for that is that if you're invited to write an overview paper of a certain topic area, then the problem there is that there's often too many different ways to summarize the same content in differently structured diagrams, right? So for example, if you, I just rejected an invitation to write a paper on corpus semantics, and one reason is that I just thought, this is going to be hell in terms of structuring, because how do you structure this? Do you structure it, by corpus method, concordancing, collocation, keywords or something? Do you structure it by semantic phenomena, polysemy, synonymy, antonymy, vagueness, other things like that? Do you structure it by, synchronic studies or diachronic versus diachronic studies? Do you structure it formal versus psycholinguistic approaches, maybe versus language acquisition? There's like, so it's such a big topic area that you can draw like 10 different mind maps, each of which makes sense, but none of the 10 helps you to see which one is best, right? And so for overview papers, I have a different writing process, that one that doesn't involve such a structure. But everything empirical, I do write like this.
Thank you. Yeah, the participant who asked about the exaggeration of the data points, he refused his question. I think I understand the question now.
Okay.
His question is, when you are doing the bootstrapping, why do you say that random samples from all data points will exaggerate the significance of the difference? You sampled by files instead of from the entire corpus.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is his or her question.
Right. So the answer, there's actually a whole paper that I can refer you to. Like, let me see which one it is on my website. Nope, not this. So I'll answer the question in a moment, right? But let me give you that link already, or that paper. So the answer is the first 4 or 5 pages in a paper on my website, which is 2022 C as in Caesar, or as in, corpus. Okay, 2022 Caesar, that discusses this. Now, so in a nutshell, the answer is the following. So if you sample on the level of the data points, then your bootstrapping approach is actually equivalent to computing something like chi-squared or the log likelihood value or something like this, because if you sample on the level of the individual data points, let's say, so the ISGB has 138,000 verbs, so if you sample on that level, then on every iteration, every verb has the same chance of being picked, as it had previously, and as it will have on the next iteration, and so on, right? But we know that the occurrences of words and the occurrences of words and constructions are not independent of each other. Right. So if something I say, let's take this talk here as an example, right? So let's face it, the word dispersion doesn't show up a ton, in normal English, right? But in this talk, it showed up multiple times because it's related to the topic. And so if one data point from this file got sampled and it includes the word dispersion, so to speak, then sampling the word dispersion again, is very likely actually if it's again this file, this conversation, because that's what the talk is about, as opposed to any other freaking file, because no one else talks about dispersion, right? And so one has to do the sampling on the level of the file or the level of the speaker, depending on what the corpus structure is, to accommodate these kinds of interdependencies. Because, if a certain word has occurred once in a conversation, the chance that it occurs there again is way higher than the chance that it occurs in any other file. Okay, and to capture that interdependence of the data points, that's what this does. Now, if the person who asked this question, if she knows mixed effects modeling, the reason why you have to do sampling, bootstrapping on the basis of files is the same reason why we need to do mixed effects modeling now for nearly everything. Right? The point of mixed effects modeling is to say, we need random effects for speakers because every speaker is different, and we need to capture their differences in the model somehow. Well, in the bootstrapping case, it's the same thing. Every conversation is different because it has a different topic. And so the chances of words occurring in them, a tea party conversation, there's no chance that dispersion comes up here, but something academic, yes, there is. And so the bootstrapping with a replacement on the level of files or speakers is the only right way for this here, because it accommodates these kinds of interdependencies.
Yes. Thank you. So I got one more question from the audience.
Of course,
and
I have
Eric
time.
asked, yeah, thank you very much. Eric asked, this score assumes normality. So is it possible to assume normality in corpus linguistics?
Let me be an ass and say, what assumes normality?
Is it z-score?
The z-score?
Yeah, z-score.
Okay, okay, but I'm not using the z-score.
I don't know why he asked this question. Maybe he asked this from other articles. So
Okay, so I mean, I do have something to say about that, but so the thing is this: so the z-score. So there's two things there. One is actually something we already touched upon. So yes, z-scores. If you use z-scores for significance testing, they involve normality. But we're not doing significance testing. The Pearson residuals, or whatever. Again, remember, there's no case where there's a p-value coming out of there. I mean, we computed confidence intervals, with the bootstrapping, but we didn't compute an asymptotic p-value that requires normality or anything else. So yes, while a z-score involves the assumption of normality of the data, it involves that assumption for the purposes of computing a p-value. We didn't do that, so we don't care. Now, second thing related to this, and that's actually something I've never fully understood myself. So the z-score and the chi-square test are, of course, related, right? So the so if you take, and you can prove that very easily. I always ask this question in boot camps. I don't expect an answer, but just to answer rhetorically the audience, what's the critical chi-square value for 1 degree of freedom? By critical, I mean, when does it become significant? Everybody should know that in their head, and of course, no one does, right? Unless you're a total freak like me. So the answer is 3.841. Okay, if a chi-squared test at 1 degree of freedom gives you a chi-squared value greater than 3.841, it's significant. Okay, and then people look at me like, yeah, why do I care? How would I have known this? Well, 3.841 is the square of 1.96, which is the z-score for a significance test, being significant at 0.05, right? So with 1 degree of freedom, the two are related. But the thing is, the chi-square test is done on frequency distributions. Okay, and the chi-square test, I mean, the chi-square curve is not normally distributed. So while there is a statistical relation between a z-score on the one hand and a chi-square test with 1 degree of freedom only on the other, this does not translate into a requirement that chi-squared data are normally distributed. That just doesn't exist.
Yeah. When the degree of freedom is very, very large, the chi-square distribution will approach a normal distribution. But when the degree of freedom is only 1, it's more like
it's like a very steep left one. It's a very
steep left one.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah, and
I also happen to remember that 3.8 number for the 1 degree of freedom chi-square test. So
and the thing is, the 1 degree of freedom, of course, is the one that is usually used in these kinds of things, right? Because you have a 2x2 table, so you have 1 degree of freedom. So the g-squared value, is evaluated at 1 degree of freedom.
Yeah. So for me, I consider those association measures g-squared and the t-test also are all special cases of chi-square tests. Is that so? Just that when the degree of freedom is 1.
That depends on what you mean by special cases. So if by special cases you mean
just
mathematically different but very highly correlated, then I would agree. But mathematically, of course, they're different, right? I mean, the log likelihood value in particular, is actually something coming out of the logistic regression model, whereas the chi-squared test, wouldn't be. But the two, I mean, I have that in my stats book. Actually, the two are 0.9 correlated. Like if you generate, I think I generate like 1,000 or 10,000 random 2x2 tables, compute chi-squared and g-squared for both of them, and they are extremely highly correlated.
Yes. So I got one more question. Sophia asked it. I think we all want to know the answer. Do you suggest that we use the new measures when we do collostructional analysis in the future, or similar studies?
Well, I mean, trivially, in one sense, yes, but here's the thing. So I think I got a similar question the other day when I presented this in Erlangen. I think the bigger question, I mean, not the bigger, but the first question one needs to answer before one does such an analysis, I think is, the first question that I mentioned in the paper, namely, why are we doing such an analysis, right? So if the purpose of the analysis is to do something where you really don't have any specific hypotheses, you just want to explore what a construction is doing, blah, 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 then I think using the Pearson residual would be a good idea, simply because it's so fast, that for instance, the bootstrapping or whatever could be done very easily. And because the results, I mean, the Pearson residual stuff, if the input data is available in the right format, it's literally like 2 or 3 lines of code, right? Whereas the previous analyses were a little bit more involved in that regard. So yes, I would recommend using that if the goal is to do something descriptive or exploratory or something. And in the paper, I skipped over the conclusion, there I basically say that, if your goal is this, then, yeah, just do that. Now, the tricky thing is that I think, I mean, no matter what I say, people will use it against me, so to speak. I mean, the thing is, collostructional analysis has been around for 20 years now.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. There's not a lot of good motivation, good reason anymore to do something purely descriptive or exploratory. I mean, by now we know to death that, words go into constructions that they're semantically or functionally compatible with. Now I'm saying you, of course, I don't mean the person asking the question, I mean like people in general. Do you really need another study that shows, oh, in this dialect and with this verb and this construction, that happens too? That's not news anymore. We know that. That's by now, after 20 years of work on this, plus another 20 years of collocational studies, that's the null hypothesis. You don't want to write a paper that confirms the null hypothesis just because, oh, no, it's another construction. So I'm thinking that especially if one is interested in, maybe cognitive or psycholinguistic or language acquisition kind of studies and stuff like that, it becomes more important now that we move our analyses to, to something that informs these kinds of other theories. And then I think, and that's the bad news, of course, then I think that the second set of suggestions is more important. And that goes along the lines of, what we discussed last week, namely, that then it becomes, so Pearson residuals are related to frequency, right? But the best analysis would be one that keeps frequency, association, dispersion, and maybe other things, salience, surprisal, whatever else we might want to measure, keep them separate, right? Because otherwise you will not be able to explain anything, right? So I think I mentioned this last week, but in case this person wasn't there, like if you have a psycholinguistic model of language production that you're working with, then you need to be able to keep things like frequency, association, and dispersion separate, because they will be represented in the model differently, right? So, for example, frequency could be like in many psycholinguistic models of activation, frequency was something like the resting level of a node for a word or a construction, right? So how active is something already simply because you're hearing it 1,000 times, and that of course might be related to dispersion in some way, but association will be the strength of connection between 2 nodes, right? And so we can't use a measure that conflates the 2 things, because then your model can actually not separate them anymore, right? And so, I mean, I know it's a long-winded answer, but so the point is, there's not a lot of good reason anymore to do just descriptive stuff or exploratory stuff. But if you have it, sure, use Pearson residuals, fine, and read the recommendation in the paper where I say, you at least then also need to do blah, blah, blah. But in general, I think the field should move ahead and go with, okay, we know this works now. Can we now use it to, answer more maybe interesting or more theoretical questions? And then the separation into different dimensions becomes more important.
Yeah.
The disadvantage, of course, being for many people that requires at least some programming skills usually, or it requires you have a co-author, who can do that for you.
Yeah, thank you. There are no more questions from the audience. Can I ask a final question?
Of course. Yeah.
So you suggest that we take frequency association and its dispersion as a tuple into consideration when determining which combination is more. Maybe the word significant is not proper here, but anyway, my question is, if we have all the statistics for these three measures, then how do we decide which group of these collostructions are more salient? Is there a cutoff point for those measures, or do we need another measure that could cluster, those values?
Okay, so there's no simple, there's a clear answer to this, but it's not a simple answer. So let me see. Okay, so part one of the answer. So it is still possible to, you're not going to believe that I'm saying this, but it's still possible to conflate the three different values into a single collostructional value, right? And so the simplest way to do this would be, and I might have mentioned this last week, but if you have one axis like this, one like this, and then the last one going back, this didn't work well, but you know what I mean, right? That kind of cube, then if you normalize all these axes to 0, 1 distance, then you can compute the Euclidean distance from the origin.
Yes.
And that would be one value, that says, how far away is it? But of course, you're losing the information. Is it this far away because of high association or dispersion or frequency, right? But you would have one value and you could just sort.
Yes. Okay.
So that's one thing one could do. Second thing one can do is, and my new book actually does this in one case study. You can prioritize dimensions over others, and you can do that in two ways. One would be that if you want this dimension, let's say this is frequency, okay, and let's say this is association. Forget about the third one. I can't gesture that, right? So if you think frequency should be more important, then you don't normalize it to 0, 1. You normalize it to 0, 2.
So you add weights to different dimensions.
Yes, exactly. Right. And so then and then that means a verb that scores highly on frequency, will score not just to 1, but to actually 2. And so it'll make the Euclidean distance bigger. Yeah. So by weighting, by basically stretching or lengthening the dimensions, you can assign a weight to each of the three parameters. Right. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do, and that's something I did. I also do in the book is, which is, I'm not yet good at speaking about it because I have only done this one time and I haven't even presented it yet. So it's like this. So you, again, 2 dimensions like this, right? And so what you might say is, okay, I want words that are far away from the origin, right? But I also want them to score highly on both dimensions. I don't want a word that's like here, that's super low on this axis, but super high here. And I don't want the corresponding thing here, something that's super down. I want words that are basically at the main diagonal, right? I want words that are here, right? So what you can do is this, you compute the Euclidean distance from the origin, and you add a third component, namely the distance from the main diagonal. So the inverse of that distance. So you reward words if they get a high Euclidean distance by being not close to the 45-degree angle. And if you have 3 dimensions, you can of course say, you know what, I'm going to prioritize frequency and association and not dispersion. So I want words that are close to the main diagonal, but only for these two. And then again, you'll get a single score.
Yes.
Now, so those are all ways that you can use to get good or better rankings if there's some degree of conflation involved. Okay. Now, the other part of the answer, of course, is, well, don't conflate, but, look at that cube, now again with the 3 dimensions, and look and find out, okay, which words score highly because of frequency, but not so much the other things, which words score highly because of association, even if the other things are not that strong, and which score highly for dispersion. Right, because for language acquisition, I think we talked about that last week briefly, that'll be important, right? Because I think it was in the conversation you and I had afterwards, right? This nonce verb learning, or this nonce color word learning, right? I mean, there, obviously, frequency was not important and dispersion was not important because it just happened a single time. But what was important was the super high association, right? So depending on what you're studying, it will be useful to be able to keep these things apart. And one thing I think I didn't mention last week, and then I'll shut up for this question, is that, if you do this for keywords analyses, for example, the words that are down here are completely different from the words that are up here. So in a keywords analysis that includes dispersion, for example, you will find that the words that are characteristic or key for a certain corpus, because of association or because of frequency, are completely different family of words than words that are characteristic for a corpus because of dispersion, right? So, and I have one paper and then one chapter in the book, one case study in the book that show, if you conflate that, you're going to miss that, right? So there's different, depending on how far you want to push it, there's different ways that you can choose. And so these were just some of them.
Yes. I ask this question because I still have this mindset of ranking things. Because, when we calculate these measures separately, we tend to rank them by the value. I'm still thinking that. So,
well, okay, and I'm not even saying that that's a bad thing, right? Because of course we need to decide, where do we stop, right? And typically people say I stop after 20 or I stop after 50, but that's of course not data driven. That's just 50 size is a nice sounding number or something. But actually, if you look at this paper that I recommended to the other person asking the question, the 2022C paper, there I actually, let me show you this just real quick. Do you see my desktop?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so let me get to the page here and show you that paper. Now, this is not like I'm the greatest at anything, but this is kind of high-tech stuff. I'm not sure many people are even doing this, but to show you what's possible, okay? So you can do the bootstrapping in a multi-dimensional way. So in this plot here, you have just the how much these verbs like to occur in a specific construction. Okay, and you have and I'm tupelizing it, so you have frequency on the x-axis and you have association on the y-axis. But I'm also doing the bootstrapping thing on this. So in every one of the 500 iterations, there's also a bootstrapping. For each. So for the computation of the frequency and the association, this is done, 500 or actually here 3,000 times to get these ellipses. Okay, and so that the ellipsis here is the equivalent of a 2-dimensional confidence interval, right? It's this wide because that's the confidence interval for the frequency, and it's this high that's the confidence interval for the association. And this can be really interesting because, for example, here you can see how give and tell are attracted to the ditransitive and how strongly they overlap, right?
How did you make these figures complicated figure? Does it come with the R package?
Well, I mean, this is written in R, yes. So it uses a concept that is called a data ellipsis. So a data ellipsis is essentially something like a confidence interval. It's a confidence ellipsis, right? And so, for example, here, this was a case that had to do with a legal application, namely the degree to which the words gender and sex are different in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the aughts. Right, and the law case doesn't matter here. It was a case that was litigated at the Supreme Court of the United States. Okay, but the point was that especially in the 1960s, but even later, gender was much less frequent, much less widely dispersed than the word sex, and so a certain law that was passed in the 60s didn't use the word gender simply because that wasn't a word back then. It hardly existed. Okay, and so here I'm looking at the frequency of the two words gender and sex and the dispersion. Okay, and you can see, and I'm doing this with bootstrapping, and you can see in the 60s the word gender was so rare, it was actually nearly only one file, which is why the dispersion interval is so huge, right? But none of the intervals actually ever reach the ones for sex. So this word is just way more frequent, way more widespread all the time, even now, right? And so ranking per se isn't bad at all, but if you need to do it, then you can. I mean, one way would be to say, I'm not defining a cutoff point like 12 or 20 or something. You're just saying the cutoff point is when these ellipses stop overlapping, because then now there's significant differences. Done.
Okay. Thank you so much. And here's marks the end of this reading session. And I really hope that we could read every linguist paper this way. Maybe this is a good start, because I see on some YouTube channel, some people from computer sciences, they interpret those classical literatures. Like the attention is all you need. That paper has been read by many people on YouTube. So maybe we could do similar things in linguistics. I don't know whether someone else is doing this, but maybe this is the first time we started this. So perhaps we could build a repertoire of those, the paper guided reading by the author himself, and then you could watch the video over and over again. It's much faster than read by ourselves, especially for people like us who are like EFL learners. English is not our native language, so we read it really slowly. It takes several hours to finish a paper, and not always rewarding, sometimes more confusing. So if we have the author to explain and like this, draw a mind map of the structure of the paper, this reading process would be much easier for us. So thank you again, Professor. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your wonderful interpretation of the paper. We have a very wonderful time with about 3,000 people in the live stream studio. And we hope we could see you more in this session in our programs. Thank you again. Have a nice weekend. So yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Please remember to join us again next week.